History loves irony, from gunpowder being originally invented as an elixir for immortality, to the inventor of Match.com having his wife bin him off for a new man she met on the site. History is littered with bizarre ironies such as these. But one such event stands out at the very peak of this prospectus of peculiar proceedings, and that will be the time that the fledgling state of Israel turned to Nazi weaponry in order to defend itself. But how did such a bizarre state of affairs come about, we hear you cry? Well, give it a quarter of an hour and we'll have told you. Let's go. From its very earliest days as a nascent proto-state within British Mandatory Palestine, Israel faced a problem: a lack of guns. For the Haganah, the main Jewish pre-independence paramilitary, the one that would eventually become the Israeli Defense Force post-independence, this wasn't too disastrous a problem early on, and for its main responsibilities of defending Jewish property and fighting in sporadic small-scale ethnic conflicts during those days, the odd shipment of hand-me-down small arms it managed to get its hands on just about got the job done. But with independence and full statehood looming on the horizon in the mid-1940s, Haganah was fully aware that its antiquated stocks of whatever it could get its hands on simply weren't going to cut the mustard for much longer. An independent Israel would be immediately surrounded by hostile nations, and so they needed lots of guns, and they needed them now. But how to go about getting their hands on them, they mused. That was a harder question than you might initially imagine, because at that point, and eventually independent Israel's loyalties and allegiances were far from established, and therefore the world's great powers weren't exactly falling over themselves to help the Jews get tooled up, with both Britain and the United States, then two of the world's biggest arms manufacturers, both enforcing total military equipment embargoes against Haganah and other Jewish paramilitaries. Eventually, they found a more than willing seller in none other than Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. This might sound like an odd pairing at first, because Stalin wasn't exactly a philosemite, what with the Doctor's Plot pogrom of 1952 to 1953, which targeted Jews in the Soviet medical sector, the 1948 to 52 anti-cosmopolitan campaign, which was a thinly veiled anti-Semitic purge, and abolition of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee in 1948, and the eventual execution of its leaders in 1952. But for the proto-state of Israel, Stalin was able to look past his lingering anti-Semitism, because helping it out offered him an opportunity to get his hands on more of the one thing he loved above all else: power. But he wasn't just blindly casting his line out and depending upon pure dumb luck to make Israel bite into his hook, as there was actually quite a bit of rationale to suggest that Israel could easily, and above all else willingly, be pulled into the Soviet sphere of influence once it got its independence. For example, over 500,000 Jews had served in the Red Army during World War II, and many of them had subsequently emigrated to Mandatory Palestine, where they were now able to wonder about espousing the supposed merits of Soviet socialism. And beyond this, early Zionist settlers to Mandatory Palestine had based their kibbutz communes loosely on Soviet agricultural communes. So certainly he had good reasoning to think that an independent Israel could be pulled under his control with the quality politicking and manipulation. But how to go about actually getting the guns to the Jewish paramilitaries? He couldn't exactly just load them up onto a Soviet-flagged cargo ship, sail on over to one of Mandatory Palestine's ports, and hand them over, as to do it so publicly and openly would have caused issues for Stalin. Not with the British, like you might suspect, however, as they'd basically given up on Mandatory Palestine by this point anyway. Instead, the issue lay with countries such as Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Algeria. Soviet-aligned Arabic nations, as they wouldn't exactly have been thrilled with Stalin handing over shiploads of guns to Jews. Instead, Stalin would have to find a way to get them in all sneaky-like. For this, he enlisted the help of Czechoslovakia. The country wasn't quite a puppet state just yet, as that wouldn't come until the communist coup of February 1948, but it was still a country that was absolutely dominated by communists, all of whom were only too happy to do Stalin's bidding. And as a bonus, many of those communists also happened to be pro-Zionist Jews who would be understandably very eager to help out. But using Czechoslovakia was only half of Stalin's ruse, because while using them would keep his hands off of the actual shipments themselves, if Jewish paramilitary started running around with AK-47s and SKSs, it would just be a tad obvious where they came from. So instead, he turned his attention to the enormous cache of German weaponry that had been left behind in the country after the fall of the Nazi Empire back in 1945 and offered it to Haganah. This was quite a smart move really, because after all, every victorious combatant and occupied territory from World War II was sitting on such a cache, so good luck proving where they came from. Czechoslovakia, for its part, was rather chuffed with this arrangement, even the non-communist elements of it. Stalin acted as a mere middleman for the deal and offered to let them keep the money, which was direly needed for rebuilding after World War II. As a bonus too, Hitler had also built an insane number of arms factories in the country, which had survived the war largely intact, and now were sitting unused and gathering dust. If they could get the soon-to-be independent Israel hooked on German guns, then they stood to make a lot of money firing those old factories back up. And with that, in 1947, meetings were organised between the Jewish Agency for Palestine, the largest Jewish support agency in the world, and Omnipol, a Czechoslovak industrial conglomerate founded all the way back in 1934. And in these meetings, prices were negotiated, terms were ironed out, and eventually hands were shaken. Israel was getting its Nazi guns. The actual smuggling of the Nazi guns to Mandatory Palestine was referred to as Operation Balak, and involved the use of European planes and pilots to actually fly the goods over, with European agents of Haganah being tasked to track down the plane owners and pilots who were either loyal to the Zionist cause or who could be made loyal with a large suitcase full of unmarked foreign currency. The actual transfer of both the cash and the guns was handled by Secretariat D, a holding company established by Omnipol specifically for Operation Balak. It was a company that existed only on paper and had next to no footprint, and so if they were rumbled, they would all remain in the clear, hopefully. Anyway, details on the actual shipments themselves are few and far between, but we do know that by the time Israel declared independence on the 14th of May 1948, 2 batches had been delivered successfully. The first, which occurred over dates unknown, involved the transfer of 400 MG34 machine guns, 4,500 K98 rifles, and around 500 million rounds of 7.92 times 57mm ammunition. The second, which also occurred on uncertain dates, saw an unknown number of MG34s, 5,500 K98s, and an also unknown quantity of 7.92 by 57mm rounds delivered successfully. Deliveries continued following the declaration of independence. There was no pause to legalise the process now that Israel had achieved statehood. Instead, they were far more concerned with keeping the guns flowing, a concern that proved prudent as the day after the declaration, Egyptian, Jordanian, Syrian, and Iraqi forces crossed the border and attacked, marking the beginning of the Arab-Israeli War. This outbreak of war also did nothing to delay the shipments, as Haganah, now rechristened, or should we say remikvahed, as the Israeli Defense Force, was naturally eager to keep the guns flowing, and Czechoslovakia, naturally, still wanted the cash. Ultimately, Operation Balak would continue until 1949, by which point over 35,000 K98s, 10,000 bayonets, 5,500 MG34s, 10,000 ammo belts, 1,000 P38 pistols, and 90 million rounds of 7.92 times 57mm had been delivered to Israel. Both Israel and Czechoslovakia were very keen to keep the arrangement going beyond 1949. It was a win-win for them both, after all, but unfortunately for them, Stalin was less keen. He was a man who was rather paranoid at the best of times, and the 1948 Soviet-Yugoslav split had sent him over the edge. This was an incident in which Josip Tito, the leader of communist Yugoslavia, had shaken off his Soviet chains, put his foot down, and insisted that he will be running his country on his own terms, free from Soviet meddling. The ever power-hungry Stalin took that rather badly, to say the least, and as a result, he moved to solidify his control over his remaining vassal nations. This resulted in Israel being offered an ultimatum: formally join the Soviet bloc or get cut off from all aid, including their German guns. Israel, told Stalin to insert his deal somewhere dark and stinky and chose the West, at which point Czechoslovakia, now a fully controlled Soviet puppet, was ordered to stop the weapon shipments, bringing Operation Balak to an end. So, now that we know the history of how Israel ended up with Nazi guns, let's dive into the specific details and nuances of the weapons themselves, starting with the K98. The first and by far most common Israeli K98, both in terms of quantity shipped and availability on the collector's market today, is actual World War II manufactured rifles. These wartime rifles can be found both with matching serial numbers on all of their components and with a complete mismatch of serial numbers. The matching ones came directly from Czechoslovak stockpiles, as the Czech method of storage involved taking an assembled rifle, smothering it in grease inside and out, wrapping it in grease-proof paper, and then chucking it into a warehouse. The mismatched ones are rifles that came from the Soviet stockpile, as the Soviet method of storage involved taking the rifles to pieces, smothering the individual parts in grease, then booting the parts into enormous separate piles. A warehouse for stocks, a warehouse for barrels, a warehouse for magazine plates, and so on. They made no effort to match the numbers back up upon reassembly, as it would have taken an insane amount of time, thus creating mismatched K98s. K98s from this group are easily identifiable by their Waffennamt stamp, an inspection-proof mark that was struck onto all Nazi-era weapons before being accepted into service, an example of which you can see on the screen now. On Israeli K98s, this stamp will occasionally be fully intact, but more often has either had the swastika part of the stamp scratched away or had the whole stamp ground off, in manners such as this and this. The second type of Israeli K98 consists of post-World War II manufactured rifles made specifically for Operation Balak. They bear an uncanny resemblance to the Kriegsmodel K98, a super late World War II variant that had all but the most essential features omitted to expedite production, with parts missing typically being the bayonet lug, cleaning rod, stock-mounted bolt takedown ring, and the stock's quality lacquered finish, a cheap and quick sanding and varnishing being used instead. Fortunately, at least, the markings make it all but impossible to confuse a post-World War II example with a wartime one, as a produced for Israeli example will have no Waffennamt stamps, and instead will have Czech language stampings and Star of David Israeli acceptance stamps. These examples are also seen with the enlarged winter trigger guard, initially designed for use with thick gloves on the Eastern Front. Quite how this detail ended up being included on rifles intended for the Middle East, that detail has been lost to time. Then there are Israel's FN model 1930 K98s that they purchased from Belgium in 1951. Numbers of these brought were very small, so we didn't go into it in the deal chapter, as they are something of an outlier, but they are still worth knowing about. Fortunately, these are easy to identify because, as you can see on the screen now, they have quite a different look to a typical K98. If you see a K98 with all that extra wood on top of the barrel that's covered in the Star of David stamps, odds are you're looking at one of these, nice and easy. And while we're on the subject of small batches purchased from other countries that nicely ruin our video's narrative flow, there are a few others you should be aware of. The first one being the Swedish M40. The Israelis brought a few thousand of these after the Arab-Israeli War. They are more or less physically identical to a standard Nazi-era K98. The only real way you can identify them with any certainty is by the Swedish language stampings on the receiver, which of course is also accompanied with the Star of David acceptance stamps. Then there are the Ethiopian M30 K98s, which Israel also purchased a few thousand of following the end of the Arab-Israeli War. Outwardly, these look identical to the FN Model 24 from which they were based, but as you can see, they also have a lot of extra wood going on top of their barrel. So, how do you identify one of these from the 1951 Belgian purchase? Well, fortunately, the Ethiopians put this rather extravagant stamping on top of the receiver. So if you see one of them surrounded by the Stars of David, bingo, you got one of these. Fortunately, the MG34s and P38s are significantly easier to identify. There were no extra small contracts from other countries we need to worry about, and so we're only dealing with examples that came from either Czech or Soviet stockpiles. If you come across a P38 or MG34 covered in Star of David stamps, it's an Israeli one. And if it's got mismatched serial numbers, it's from the Soviet cache. And if they match, it's from the Czech cache. Easy. Something to also be aware of is that in later years, the Israelis rechambered many of their K98s and MG34s into 7.62 x 51mm NATO to keep ammunition standard with the FN-FAL, the shiny new battle rifle they made their main service rifle in 1955. The work took place between 1956 and 1958 and was done on Swiss tooling they had lying around from an earlier failed attempt to produce K98s indigenously. Very little information is out there on the rechambered MG34s, and we couldn't even track down a single example that was or had been up for sale on the collector's market that we could use for a picture. So unfortunately, we are left to make educated guesses on this one. It stands to reason that there would be basically no outside differences to the shape of the weapon, as modifications would only have to be internally to the chamber and feed tray. Fortunately, however, as all 7.62 converted K98s had that fact stamped loudly and proudly on top of their receiver, it stands to reason that the MG34s also would have been. If anyone has a photo of one of these, please send it in. We are desperate to know more. As for the 7.62 converted K98s, we know much more about them. They are easily identifiable by the huge aforementioned 7.62 stamping on their receiver. This marking was also burnt into their stock, the receiver marking being to remind the soldier loading it that it was a conversion, and the stock marking being to remind armourers as it sat on their shelves. They are also identifiable by their new grooved stocks and a unique Israel front sight hood that used 2 holes and a rivet to secure it, rather than just the tension of the metal as is seen on a typical K98. Also of note is the fact that you will rarely, if ever, find a 7.62 converted K98 with matching numbers, because during the rechambering work, the rifles were stripped down to be fully cleaned and reblued, with the work being done Soviet style, i.e. with the parts being chunked into huge piles for the work and then not being matched back up afterwards. We have already glanced upon the combat history of Israel's Nazi guns, but let's have a look at it in some more depth. As you could probably guess from our earlier discussion, their combat debut came during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. The K98 was the de facto Israeli service rifle of the conflict, and we say de facto because while it was their most numerous rifle of the conflict by a significant margin, serving alongside a mismatched collection of whatever else Israel could get its hands on, including Ross rifles, SMLEs of various number and mark, and M1 Garands. There was never any attempt to doctrinally encode it as such. It was simply what they had the most of. Thus, we say de facto. As for their MG34s and P38s, the same story. They were some of Israel's most numerous machine guns and pistols respectively, but they serve amidst a sea of others, with other machine guns being used including Vickers guns, Browning M1919s and Bren guns, and other pistols including high powers, M1911s and Webley revolvers. After the war, Israel started to get its hands on more modern Western weaponry such as the FN-FAL we mentioned earlier, and so their Nazi guns started being issued to reservist units or sent to the kibbutzes for use in territorial defence. As for the Suez Campaign of 1956, it appears that by that time the MG34s and P38s were long gone, as we could find only passing mention to the use of K98s in conflict. And we stress passing because with the conflict being such a limited committal of troops compared to the all-out war of survival that was 1948, it appears as though it only saw use by reservist and rear echelon support troops. Then it's the same story for the 1967 Six-Day War and the 1973 Yom Kippur War. By those times, Israel was no longer a fledgling state making do with whatever it could scrape together, and thus was knee-deep in a selection of top-of-the-line military arms and without need for the K98. Except weirdly, in the role of a dedicated rifle grenade launcher, in which it appears to have continued to live on in very limited quantities till the mid-1970s. Then the K98, long having clung on as the last Nazi gun in Israeli service, was formally declared obsolete in the late 1970s, after which the vast majority of the nation's stockpile was sold off on the civilian market, where we can still find them floating about with reasonable availability to this day. So ends our brief but peculiar tale. Having heard it all in its depth, the rationale behind the Israelis' using of Nazi guns isn't quite as ridiculous as it first sounded, and actually had quite the grounded rationale behind it. But still, as far as historical ironies go, it's certainly up there nonetheless.